The first tool to prevent early season weed competition is a pre-emerge herbicide application. Now let's think about the name pre-emerge. Pre-emerge, before the crop emerges. All right, so you plant. Generally these are applied within a few days prior to planting to a few days after planting, before the crop begins to crack out of the ground or begins emergence is when these would be applied. Now your choice, as always, depends upon the weed spectrum. Because you notice across the bottom, you've got brown top millet, morning glories in the bottom left, a dayflower kind of in the center left, pigweed, smell melons over there in the top right picture. We have lots of weeds that we have to be concerned about in the state, so there's no one size fits all. Now, the LSU AgCenter weed scientist, and we published the Louisiana Suggested Weed Management Guide that provides this information about, and it says the weeds, and it shows the herbicide where you can help make choices. And then, of course, the weed scientist, myself, and others are nothing but a phone call away to help you as you were helping this grower make his or her decisions over what pre-emerge herbicide to use in their soybean crop. Now, pre's are residual herbicides, and they do require precipitation for activation, whether it be rainfall on the left, whether that require activation. If you spray a herbicide on dry dirt and it does not rain for a month, that herbicide was never activated, it begins to degrade like all chemicals will, and you will not get activity. So they do require, and that is the risk. That is a risk, but the risk is always worth the reward, because if you think about Louisiana, it's not very often we go without rain for an extended period of time. Generally, we're going to catch a rain 9 times out of 10. Now, what is the importance of residual herbicide application? So let's look at this picture. There on the left, this is no rainfall and non-incorporated. Those little black dots, nothing but weed seed, going from the soil surface on the left down to 4 inches. Now, the orange color, which is right across the very top of the surface, is the herbicide. If you don't get any rain or irrigation, it doesn't get incorporated by tillage or by rainfall. That herbicide is not even close to the weed seed, so it's not going to prevent germination. It's not going to prevent emergence of that weed seed, so it's not doing your job. Now, if we have rainfall or irrigation or proper incorporation, notice that herbicide's in orange color. Now it's down in that zone to where it can prevent weed emergence, so you're getting your bang for your buck. That's what we want. Now, unfortunately, it does go too far to the one side. If it rains 5 inches after you apply your herbicide and you get great big puddles in the field, the grower does, that herbicide will leach through the soil profile, then end up below where the actual weed seed are, and you will have a failure at that point. If the grower doesn't have irrigation, and we're on the port on the right, and it doesn't rain, you can't help that from a recommendation standpoint, because all of our information says that a pre-emerge herbicide is what you absolutely need to do for proper early season weed control management. If you get to the far right, where you have too much rainfall, honestly that's something that we can't help. But the point is, the program in the middle will help you maximize weed seed, not weed seed, but soybean yield. Another issue that growers will mention to you as you're talking to them about pre-emerge herbicides is that I don't want to hurt my soybeans. If I spray that on my soybeans, as the soybeans emerge, it's going to injure them. And yes, there are times that herbicides do injure soybeans. You can see on the top left, that is a non-treated. Those soybeans are at unifoliate. The first trifoliate just begin to emerge, but the next 3 pictures are treated with various different herbicides. So you can see as a grower, and you as a county agent walk in this field and see this, they can be quite upset. Now, of the years that I have been doing this research, very rarely have I seen this kind of injury cause a yield reduction. Generally, it's a cosmetic injury. Soybeans are very adaptive. They can not the word survive, but they will be able to compensate for early season soybean injury such as this. Now, if it turns off into a desert drought after this injury, or if he lets insects infest his field or diseases, that's something other than the herbicide injury. But in the situations where I've had good growing conditions following this injury, and it's just not 1 year, this is multiple years I've been evaluating these herbicides, I generally do not have a yield reduction. So it's just a cosmetic injury where you just let the grower understand. Tell him prior to, you may get some injury on your soybeans, but this is the way we're going to maximize your yield, because we're maintaining our soybeans weed-free for the first 5 weeks after emergence. So the point is, why use a pre? Well, you need to protect the soybeans, as I pointed out, as from early season soybean competition for the first 5 weeks, and I keep saying that, but it's important for our growers to understand. Why? Because of that slide right there. If you maintain those soybeans weed-free for the first 5 weeks, you will maximize. I mean, even for 4 weeks, it's 97% of the check, so 97% of 70 bushels. That's great, but that other 3% at the price of soybeans are at the time of filming of this presentation, that's money that's lost that would have paid for that pre-emerge herbicide application. And here's a perfect example. 2 fields where it got too wet and too windy to spray a post-emerge herbicide. On the right, the grower used a residual herbicide. On the left, they did not. Tell me which one's going to have maximum yield. The one on the right that was clean because a residual herbicide was used. Because it may be too wet, maybe too windy for aerial applications or ground applications, you can't spray a foliar herbicide because a lot of growers will do that. They'll plant soybeans without a residual herbicide thinking, oh, I'll be back in there in a week to 2 weeks and I'll spray something, a foliar herbicide, and I'll control those weeds. I can control them the first 5 weeks. Well, if it's too windy for an airplane to fly and spray, or it's too wet for a ground rig to run and spray the herbicide, and the weeds are competing with the soybean crop, you are losing yield based off the data that we have. Moving into our post-emergence application, and this is important because now we're going to focus mainly on early post applications. Early post-emergence applications typically include a tank mix of a foliar herbicide and a herbicide that provides residual control. For example, in Roundup-Ready soybeans, which we'll discuss later, Roundup or glyphosate plus residual herbicide. The glyphosate provides foliar activity of a weed that begins to emerge through the pre-emerge. All right, you understand that? Pre-emerges are going to break down. You can only expect a pre-emerge herbicide, when properly activated, to provide you 3.5 to 4 weeks control of weeds. Lots of times there's 3 weeks. So at that point at 3 weeks, your soybeans should be anywhere from V2 to V3, so 2 to 3 trifoliates. That's where it requires a post-emergence application, but we need to use a residual herbicide to protect those soybeans for the next 2 weeks. So we get out to 5 weeks, and that may be with a ground rig or with an airplane. These applications can occur. To point out the reason that we need to use a residual herbicide from a pre-emerge standpoint followed by an early post-emergence, it's a little cartoon that I've drawn here. So percent weed control there on the left from 0 to 100. You notice little bars. And that red bar, the first one, is where the herbicide, the residual herbicide applied pre, is actually providing 100% control. Now notice it begins to fade as it goes from right to left during the growing season from soybean emergence through mid-season. That's when you need to apply a residual herbicide as an early post. So then you've got another layer. So you're overlaying, as the title of the slide says, you're overlaying your residual herbicides pre followed by early post to protect those soybeans from weed competition for the first 5 weeks after emergence. Now our target for our early post-emergence application is generally V2 to V3 soybeans. That's where it has 2 to 3 trifoliates have emerged from the apical meristem of the plant. Residual herbicides typically provide about 3 weeks of control if properly activated. So if you get 3 weeks out of your pre-emerge and you get 3 weeks out of your early post-emerge residual activity, you actually have a residual barrier for 6 weeks control. That is within that window of 5 weeks. So we have successfully done our job of helping the grower maintain his soybeans weed-free for the first 5 weeks after emergence. Now, the precautions that you need to understand about residual early season post-emergence herbicides. Not all residual herbicides are labeled for use pre can be applied post-emergence to soybeans. Not all herbicides that are labeled for post-emergence use in soybeans should be applied to soybeans of size that are V2, V3. So the point is, use the weed guide that we will discuss a little bit later. Use your contacts, your LSU AgCenter weed scientist to help make these decisions, because it's not just a one-size-fits-all. The program as a general, residual followed by residual, is, but it's the choice of what those herbicides are that we will need to discuss with you. To point out, you can use the weed guide or us for help. Now, the next step is a mid-post. So when the soybeans are V5, V6, so 5 to 6 trifoliates, or a late post later than V6. Now I'm going to be honest with you. If a grower chooses to wait this late to spray his weeds, yes, we can kill the weeds, but he's cost himself money. So at this point when you're talking to a grower, if he or she has waited this late, you can never say, I told you so, and chastise. You can say, next time, you're going to cost yourself some yield. Let's start talking about next year, what we can do from this standpoint. But there are tools that we can use if you've got to spray at this point. Now, another example, if a grower's used a pre, he's used an early season residual, he or she may need to come back with another herbicide application. We are in Louisiana, where we have numerous weed species we have to deal with, lots of crop rainfall, we can have multiple emergence of weeds over time. The same weed species can emerge, have multiple emergences throughout the growing season, and we need to maintain these weeds free. From this standpoint, really is from just keeping the crop clean. If a grower wants to keep it will help with yield from a mechanical harvest situation, but it's not really going to cost him yield if the weeds that are emerging at this point during the season. But there is a caution. All herbicide applications are limited by soybean growth stage or pre-harvest interval. This is where we run into this, because lots of times soybeans in Louisiana will be about V6, so 6 trifoliates, and they immediately start flowering. So they enter into R1. Well, glyphosate cannot be applied over the top of Roundup Ready soybeans past R2. Liberty cannot be applied over top of Liberty Link soybeans past R1. Dual Magnum, for example, is only soybean emergence through V3. Herbicide trade names Flexstar and Cobra have a 45-day pre-harvest interval, so a month and a half before harvest. So you see there's lots of moving parts and pieces here. So once again, that's why you have us to help you out. But to understand the principle of it, you have lots of tools to utilize for weed management in a mid to late post application timing. But one of the best programs that utilizes cultural and chemical methods of weed management, in all honesty, for example, is you plant a soybean in a narrow row system, you apply a residual herbicide pre, follow that with a foliar herbicide tank mixed with residual herbicide early post, the same thing we discussed earlier, except we've added in narrow row soybeans, planted anywhere from 10 or inches less apart. The narrow row spacing will possibly achieve canopy closure, with proper grower conditions it will, and thus shade the soil to inhibit late season weed emergence. We've already discussed that. The fact that we've overlaid residual herbicides early in the season results in a clean crop. Now notice the left on the right, and I show these two pictures. On the left is narrow row soybeans doing exactly what we just talked about. Residual pre followed by residual early post. This grower will not have to make another application mid nor late post. The grower on the right in the wide row beans may very well need to apply a mid to late post application of a herbicide to control the weeds, because he will begin to have weed emergence there in the row middles. That shows you the advantage from a cultural weed control standpoint by just narrowing your row spacings. You can see how this all fits together in a nice little puzzle.